know how long it's been exactly, 3-4 weeks or so. We had the last 2 Wednesdays off, so to speak. We didn't have church because of the holiday season. And I think the Wednesday before that, I had gotten the flu, and I'm thankful, Brady, you filled in for me, right? So yeah, it's been a few weeks. It's been about 4 weeks since we were last together. So tonight, we are finally going to finish the patristic era of church history. I told you guys originally that I was going to keep this to 4 weeks per period of church history, so it'd be 16 weeks altogether because you've got 4 eras of church history: patristic, medieval, Reformation, and modern. But that kind of went out the window pretty quick. I'm trying my best to move through this quickly because I don't want us to spend a lot of time. I mean, we could spend a very, very long time in this, but I do want us to get back to our traditional Wednesday night practice of going through a book of the Bible. So anyway, tonight then we come to the end of the patristic period. That is the era of the church fathers. We move into the Middle Ages. Now, we start with what you'll find in your notes, number 11. That's the final section of the patristic notes. So if you have all those notes, if you've been keeping those, this will be the final one. It'll be point number 11. There was some question as to whether I should include this in the section on the church fathers or whether I should include this in the section on the Middle Ages. But I decided to put the information here on Gregory the Great at the tail end of the patristic era. I mean, Gregory is known as a church father, but his life, his ministry, his rule as the Bishop of Rome is really the transition from the patristic era into the Middle Ages, okay? So what we have here is essentially the first medieval pope. So the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, so, right now, Francis is the current Bishop of Rome. The Pope, he's the one who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. He's supposedly, allegedly, the vicar of Christ. He's sort of Christ's representative on earth, so it is said. And he is as far as human beings are concerned, the head of the church, right? Not just, according to Roman Catholics, not just the Roman Catholic Church, but the church as a whole, because the Roman Catholic Church is the one true church. So we are beginning now to see the rise and the solidification of the Roman bishop as supreme. Until this point, you have several bishops that have sort of operated on equal footing. Constantinople, Alexandria, other very important places, their bishops were noted for their influence, for their sway in the affairs of the church, but now you will begin to see the Roman bishop become supreme. And so then as we get into the Middle Ages, you're going to see we'll talk about the split between East and West. We'll be focusing most of our attention on the West because that is really what is most applicable to us, because you and I are inheritors of that Western Christian tradition. Yes, even that Roman Catholic tradition, because the Reformers were coming out of that, were responding to that, so on and so forth. I mean, just, to give you an example, we do not have the same doctrine, and we will talk about this when we come to the Reformation. Our whole understanding of justification, how we're made right with God, vastly different from the Roman Catholic churches. But the very fact that as Protestants we place such an emphasis on justification. Now, I think it's biblical that we place so much emphasis on justification. I mean, that's at the very heart of the gospel. How can a man be made right with God? You go from being in the wrong with God to being under his judgment to now being right with God and under his favor. I mean, that's, for Paul in the book of Romans, which is the greatest letter greatest book in the New Testament, greatest book in all of Scripture, arguably, this exposition of the gospel, that's at the heart of what Paul is talking about when he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, right? But there's also a historical reason why, as Protestants, we are so focused upon the doctrine of justification. And it's because the Western tradition as a whole was very concerned with that legal issue of how is a person made right with God. When you go into Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the centerpiece of salvation isn't justification so much as it is what's called deification, that is, becoming like God. And to you and me, that whole thing sounds just incredibly alien to us, right? We talked about Athanasius, for example, the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, the Bishop of Alexandria. Well, one of his famous statements from his book on the Incarnation is, God became man so that men might become God. That sounds heretical to us. Now, Athanasius was most certainly not saying, I love Athanasius, he's a hero of mine. He was not saying that you and I become God in the sense that Jesus is God, or that God the Father is God. He's not saying it in a Mormon sense. He's saying, in essence, that we are taken up into the life of God, that we're conformed, as Peter says, to the divine nature, that we become, we might say, like God, okay? So this whole idea is central in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, whereas justification is central in Western Christianity, okay? So we'll talk about the split between East and West. Part of it had to do with this whole notion of, is the Roman bishop supreme, like Rome claims for itself? And so from then on, you have two branches of Christianity, East and West, and then of course with the Reformation, you have, this is an oversimplification, but three branches of Christianity: Eastern Orthodox, Western Roman Catholic, and then Western Protestant. Again, that's vastly oversimplified, but just for the sake of simplicity, okay? So with Gregory the Great, in the year 590, we begin to see the real, not so much the rise, but the codification of this idea of Roman supremacy in the church. I started in your notes with a quotation from Earl Cairns' textbook, Christianity Through the Centuries. The consecration of Gregory I as the Bishop of Rome constitutes a watershed that divides the ancient period of church history from the medieval period. One should always remember, however, that periodization in history is an artificial mechanism to organize the God-given order of history into manageable segments. In other words, it's hard to, you can't draw exact lines in history, okay? You don't go from, well, we're in the patristic era this day to the medieval era the next day, right? That's not how people living in that would have thought. But looking back on it, it's just a helpful way, a helpful thing for us to divide history into these different segments. The year 590 is chosen for this work, that is Cairns' work, for the beginning, as the beginning of the Middle Ages, that is, because Gregory I ushered in a new era of power for the church in the West in that year. So again, roughly speaking, the patristic era runs from about 100. As a round number, you could say maybe mid-90s, because in the mid-90s you have the death of the final apostle, the Apostle John. It could well be that First Clement is written in the 90s. We talked about Clement of Rome. But just as a round number, 100, AD 100 to, again, roughly 600 AD, or 590, which is the consecration of Gregory as the Bishop of Rome. Yes, brother? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Oh, to me, it's beautiful. Oh, of course. To me, it's absolutely beautiful. So if you're familiar with Gregorian chants, if you're not, maybe go watch a movie about the Middle Ages or something, or a movie that takes place in the Middle Ages. I mean, we call it Gregorian because it all comes from Gregory the First, Gregory the Great. So yeah, good point, brother. I'm glad you brought that up. So we're just going to cover Gregory there's much more that can be said, but just as an overview because he is so important. Gregory the First, or as he is also known, Gregory the Great, he lived from 540 to 604. He's been called by Cairns the first medieval pope. Now the word pope comes from the Latin term for father. So you will hear Catholics refer to the Pope as the Holy Father. That's what Pope literally means, father. So this is the first medieval Pope. Gregory's influence was far-reaching and greatly impactful. He was born into a wealthy family, but he abandoned his inheritance and his wealth in order to serve God. He became a monk and was eventually chosen to be the Bishop of Rome. Now, because this is just an overview, and we're really staying very much on the surface for a lot of our discussion, I have not discussed with you the rise of monasticism. But by this time, monasticism has been firmly entrenched in the Christian tradition, both East and West. Somebody tell me, what's a monk? When you hear the word monk, what do you think of? Monastery, okay? What's a monastery? Place where? Okay, in your mind, okay. So monastery, anything else? Yeah, good. So a monk, I'm sorry? Writing the scriptures. So a monk is someone who has given his life, or her life, in the case of a nun, to the service of God. It usually involves a very ascetic, austere sort of existence. You're renouncing worldly pleasures. There's typically a couple of forms of monasticism that have developed. I mean, you have, anybody here ever heard of St. Anthony? St. Anthony is sometimes called the founder of monasticism. He was an Egyptian monk. Actually, Christian monks existed before Anthony came on board, but Anthony was very, very influential in the sort of the launch of monasticism as a movement within Christianity. But you would have monks who lived totally by themselves in absolute isolation and seclusion. Now that didn't become the norm because, as you can imagine, living decades by yourself could be quite taxing on a person mentally, and also it's just blatantly unbiblical. But you would then have a more communal form of monasticism where monks would live together, eat together, they'd raise their own food, they would have church services, there'd be a church inside the monastery where the monks would stay. We owe a great deal to Christian monks because they devoted their lives to study, to prayer, and to the preservation of the scriptures. If you guys can remember way back when we had our series on how we got the Bible, we talked about New Testament and Old Testament textual criticism. Because in an era before printing, before Johannes Gutenberg invents the movable type printing press, if you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to make you a copy. You either copied it yourself or you hired somebody, and it was a very expensive, long, painstaking process. Somebody had to copy it letter by letter, word by word, line by line. Well, how were the scriptures copied? In the early years, they were copied by anybody really who could do the job. But as we come into the Middle Ages and into the late patristic era, it's monks who are copying these works, not just the works of Scripture, the books of Scripture, but even ancient works as well. So we owe a great deal to monasticism. Well, Gregory became a monk and eventually was appointed as the Bishop of Rome. Though he adopted a humble demeanor and called himself the servant of the servants, Gregory oversaw the immense growth of the power and prestige of Rome's bishop. So he did seek to be humble, called himself, I'm merely the servant of the servants. That is, I serve those who serve God. I love that title. That's a great thing for any pastor, any Christian leader to think about. You exist to serve God's servants. But despite all of that, he did oversee the growth of the power and prestige of Rome's bishop. As Cairns put it, although he disclaimed the title of pope, he exercised all of the power and the prerogatives of later popes. So don't call me that, but I'm going to act like that, is essentially what you have. And then finally, I put this in there, brother, for Rachel, but she's not here. So anyway, it was because of Gregory's influence that Britain was brought into the sphere of Roman Christianity. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The Venerable Bede. The Venerable Bede. Anybody here ever heard of Bede? B-E-D-E. He was a British Christian historian and has left us a treasure trove of information about Britain in this time period. Well, he tells the story of Gregory in Rome, and he comes upon some British boys who are being sold as slaves on the auction block. And he inquires about them because he was struck by their features, their blonde hair and their blue eyes. And he was told that these are Angles. You've heard of Anglo-Saxon, okay? These are Angles. And he said, no, these are not Angles, these are angels. And so apparently, according to Bede's story, it was because of that encounter with these young Brits that were being sold as slaves in Rome that he commissioned a monk named Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo. This is a different Augustine. He commissioned Augustine to go and to evangelize the British Isles. And so, regardless of whether that story is true or not, it is true that because of Gregory's influence and because of Augustine, this monk missionary that was sent to the British Isles, that Britain was brought under the sphere of Roman Christianity. Now, why do I say Roman Christianity? Well, there was already a Celtic version of Christianity in the British Isles. We'll talk about that just a little bit later. Any questions before we close out? Yes, brother? That's a good question. I think it was used before Gregory. I feel very certain about that because, again, it just means father. So I don't know how widespread it was, if it was, how confined it was. That's probably a basic question to somebody that studies this era. I'm just not aware of it myself, but it's a good question. When was that title first used? But again, with Gregory, what you and I think of as the Pope, that's when it all begins, is with Gregory. Again, there had been a bishop of Rome going way back, but Gregory solidifies this idea of the supremacy of Rome among all of the churches in Christendom. And at this time, of course, we do have, if you've heard the term Christendom, people will even to this day use Christendom as a synonym for Christianity. That is not the case. So if you're reading a book, you may have an author who talks about, modern day Christendom or whatever. Christendom and Christianity are not synonymous. Christendom refers to the union of church and state that you have beginning with Constantine, when Constantine is converted to the faith and begins to shower the church with privileges. So remember Constantine way back in the 300s in the 4th century. Now he didn't say that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire. That was Theodosius after him, but he began to show favor to Christianity. And you begin to have this union of church and state, a state-sponsored, state-run church. That's Christendom, okay? And so Christendom, there was a brief hiccup with Christendom in one of the emperors who ruled shortly after Constantine, Julian the Apostate. He actually abandoned Christianity that he was raised in and turned back, converted to the old pagan Roman ways, and there's a lot of story there, but he didn't rule very long. And so you had this succession of quote-unquote Christian emperors. And so by the time then you come to Gregory, you have, not just the emperor, but you got to deal with the Bishop of Rome. And of course, the relationship between the emperor and the pope becomes something very important for later church history, okay? Yes? That's an open question, I would say. I mean, he was baptized late in life, basically on his deathbed, and we talked a little bit about that. But I mean, I think there's a serious question as to the genuineness of his conversion, in terms of what you and I would consider as a genuine conversion. But perhaps, I mean, he retained the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman religion. I mean, there was a lot of things about the traditional pagan religion of Rome that he retained, which again kind of casts doubt on that. I mean, how much does he genuinely believe the teachings of Christianity, or is he simply using Christianity as a tool to unify his empire? That's an open question. Yes, modern day Turkey. No. That would be the ancient city of Byzantium. So it was a smaller city, but he wanted to plant a new Rome in the east. And so he founded what is now known as what we know of as Constantinople. That's a good question. Yeah, it's Istanbul, right? Yeah, it's Istanbul. Yeah, so we'll talk about that. Well, I mean, yeah, Constantinople is going to play a big role it does play a big role in church history. And so, yeah, I mean, with the Muslim invasions and whatnot, and it's very important for that. We won't focus much on that. But yes, I mean, as far as, Constantinople becomes sort of the chief see, the bishopric in the east. And so there's this rival between Constantinople and Rome, even though the Bishop of Constantinople is not going to assume the same sort of rights and privileges as the Bishop of Rome. I mean, it's I'm not sure the exact distance from Turkey to. It's modern day Istanbul from Constantinople to Ephesus. I'm not sure about that. Geography is not my strongest subject. I'm not sure what's there now. I mean, you can visit the ruins of ancient Ephesus, but yeah, Mark would be a much better source for that sort of information than I. So I'll just defer to him. Diana. Yeah. Artemis is the Greek name. Diana is the Latin. Yeah. Oh, I'm not sure. I mean, there is. I don't doubt that there's some of that influence there. So, well, let's start with the medieval era then, and we have first of all the question of terminology. You've probably heard the Middle Ages, referred to as the Middle Ages. Referred to as the Dark Ages, the medieval period. Even the term medieval refers to middle, something that takes place in between two other things. And so really all of the different ways, I mean, Dark Ages is most certainly the worst way of referring to the Middle Ages, because there was a lot of culture that was developed, a lot of learning and so forth. It wasn't just a period of ignorance and so on and so forth, like sometimes you will hear. I mean, Christianity caused the culture of medieval Europe to flourish. But even that term middle, I mean, that's intended to say, well, there was an ancient period of greatness and glory with the Greeks and the Romans, and then according to Renaissance authors and thinkers, you have this sort of, Renaissance is a rebirth okay, in the 15th century of the glories of ancient Rome and Greece. And then you got this middle period, the Middle Ages that sort of separates us from what was really good way back when. So even the term Middle Ages is not a neutral expression. It was originally intended to say we had this hiccup in culture between the glories of ancient Greece and the glories of ancient Rome, and now what we are recovering. We are causing all these things to be reborn in the Renaissance. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So it is difficult, if not impossible, as we mentioned earlier, to demarcate the transition from antiquity to the medieval period of history. For the purposes of our study, we'll say it commences around 600 and ends around 1500, okay? The historical period was called Middle Ages to designate it as the era between antiquity and the modern age, all right? The term Dark Ages is a misnomer. It's just not accurate. It's not accurate to describe medieval times as backwards and entirely devoid of culture and intellectual progress. Okay, so that then brings us to the rise of Islam. That's the first thing that we need to think about whenever we talk about the Middle Ages, because it is in the early Middle Ages that you have the rise of this new religion known as Islam, which we are all dealing with even to the very present as one of the great global religions. It all begins, of course, with Muhammad, born in 570, died in 632. He was a tribesman from the Arabian Peninsula, so think Middle East. And he began proclaiming a monotheistic faith and experienced backlash within his predominantly polytheistic culture. So he claims that God visited him and gave him a revelation about the truth, that people should not worship many gods, but should worship one God who is named, according to Muslims, Allah, which is just the Arabic term for God. What is the central confession of faith, the Shahada in Islam? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. If you say those words and mean them, you are a Muslim. That is how one is constituted a Muslim. You say and confess and mean those words. There is no God, but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff about Muhammad. I'm not an expert on the life of Muhammad. Muhammad did think that at first he was being visited by a demon, these so-called revelations that he was receiving. You make of that what you will. But eventually he came to think of himself as a prophet blessed by God to recover the true religion. The spread of this new religious movement was slow at first, but in 629, Muhammad had acquired enough power to capture Mecca, in modern-day Saudi Arabia, a city from which he was forced to flee only a few years before because of opposition to his beliefs. So he flees from Mecca, but then in the year 629, he has amassed enough of a force to conquer the city of Mecca. So slow at the beginning, only a few converts to this new religion that had come on the scene, but eventually it begins to spread literally like wildfire. In the century following Muhammad's death, Islam spread rapidly, and that is an understatement. I meant to have forgive me for forgetting, I meant to put up a map so that you could see the spread of Islam in the century after Muhammad's death, but you can find one of those easily enough on, just Google that and you'll see exactly how far this religion spread. In 732, so this is exactly 100 years after Muhammad's death, Muslim expansion to the west was stopped by a man named Charles Martel. Martel means hammer. He was a Frankish leader, that is a French leader. Stopped by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in modern-day France. This victory is one of the most significant moments in American history. So the Muslims begin to spread out of the Middle East. They go across North Africa, even into Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. They cross into Frankish territory, into France. And really, there's a question. How much, who's going to be able to stop these Muslims? Because they were on the cusp of taking over all of Europe, okay? If it weren't for the Battle of Tours and Charles Martel that stopped the Muslim advance, you and I would be in very different circumstances, okay? Because, you would have had Islam spreading into Western Europe. You would have had a very different history of Western Europe, a very different history of Christianity. It would have played out in a vastly different fashion from the way that it has. So the Battle of Tours, it cannot be overstated, the importance of this battle for the history of Western civilization. If you're taking a Western Civ class in college, you're going to talk about the Battle of Tours, because this allowed the Christian West to develop as it did, for European culture, European politics to develop as they did, okay? So Islam then is characterized by fierce devotion to Unitarian monotheism. What do I mean? What do I mean by Unitarian monotheism? Why not just say monotheism? Anybody? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah. They deny the Trinity. You can't just say that Islam is monotheistic. It is. But there's more to it than that. Islam is, when it comes to monotheism, they're Unitarian, not Trinitarian. So God is one God, but also one person. The Christians, who according to the Quran worship three, and by the way, for the Quran, it's God the Father, Jesus, and Mary. They had Muhammad did not understand the doctrine of the Trinity, okay? So that's polytheism. That's heresy, according to Islam. We are the true monotheists. Now, there were places, it's interesting, the Muslims had a kind of respect for Jews, because Jews were monotheists as well. They had a certain amount of respect for Christians. We were called the people of the book by Muslims alongside the Jews. And so when Muslim invaders would come into a new land, I had my first year at Southeastern, when I was in college at Southeastern College at Wake Forest, one of my roommates in our apartment was Egyptian and had moved to the States when he was about 2 years old. So he would speak Arabic on the phone at night with his parents. His birthday was September 11th. It was an great guy. Interesting conversations were had. But his family was Christian as far back as he could remember. Because when the Muslims came into Egypt, his ancestors paid a tax to continue to worship as Christians rather than convert to Islam. You had that option. You were considered as an outcast of society, but they didn't kill you necessarily if you paid this tax that allowed you to essentially remain Christian. And so, that was kind of a question I had for him. Did your family at some point come out of Islam? And he said, no, we've just been, we've been Christian as far back as we can remember, because our ancestors paid the tax, and we continued to pass along Christianity within our family. And so he was raised, even in Egypt, in a Christian home. So the Lord had been very gracious to this man. Now, by the way, what does Islam mean? Well, we were all told in the aftermath of 9/11 that Islam means peace, okay? That's all Islam means. It means peace. Well, is that true? Yeah, it's true. But it's a certain kind of peace. It's peace through, and this is a better rendering, submission. So a Muslim is literally a person who submits. One of you'll hear if you're in a Muslim country, an Arabic-speaking country, the term "Salam alaikum," which is a traditional greeting among Muslims. It means peace be to you. Salam means peace. It's similar to shalom, which means peace in Hebrew, but it's very, very different. It's peace that comes through submission to a greater power. And Islam is a language of submission, and yes, I would argue it is a religion of submission through military force. You might say, well, we believe in peace through submission. That is true. But we don't believe in spreading our faith at the tip of the sword. That is very much part of the history of Islam. I'll never be able to run for office, okay, because this is going to be on the internet forever, but that is historically accurate, all right? That is historically accurate. That it is peace that comes through bowing the knee to an army that is invading you, telling you, you either pay a tax or you get your head cut off if you don't want to be Muslim. Any questions, comments? Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because electricity already was worshipped.
Yes. Very good point. Very good point. So why is it that according to the Quran, this idea, Muhammad knew that Christians were Trinitarian, that Christians worshiped three persons, but he misunderstood. And so the very fact, you're right, that Mary, he's seeing, okay, well, they have the Father, they have Jesus, and then they have Mary. He is seeing this devotion to Mary in some of these early Christian communities. And so he just assumes that Mary, according to Christians and according to Christian theology, is divine and ought to be worshiped. So it's a good point, very good point. All right. Well, we'll stop at this point, okay? So, I'm sorry, yes? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so... Yes. So, well, he was definitely, he was most certainly born again believer in Christ. So yeah, it's hard whenever you're talking about church history and you're using this language of Christian, because it goes back to this question, for example, was Constantine a Christian? Well, in one sense, in a sociological, cultural sense, absolutely, because he identified with Christianity. He was baptized. But there's an open question as to whether he's truly converted and what you and I would consider a real Christian, redeemed, right, going to heaven. So yeah, that's an important question. It's a good question because that term can be very elastic especially whenever you're considering the history of the church, because we're going to talk about Christianity in the Middle Ages in Europe. Well, a lot of it was not biblical Christianity. We have to have a term for it, and it's just simplest to call it Christian theology, Christian Europe, et cetera, and so forth. But you're right. So at times I'm using it in a historical, sociological, cultural sense, and at times I'm going to use it in what you and I would consider a biblical sense. Most of the time, however, it will be in that kind of that cultural, sociological sense, and I'm using it in very broad ways, because sometimes I just, when I refer to Christian, I just simply mean general Christian teaching on the Trinity, on the deity of Christ, etc. Right? In other words, things that Christians share in common, whether they be Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Protestants. So yeah, please, that's a good question. Just remember that I'm using this in a very broad term, in a very broad sense, most of the time, to refer to groups of people, nations that would consider themselves Christian. And that looking back, again, from a sociological standpoint, cultural, historical standpoint, we can name them Christian because of their outward practice. That's just the simplest way. But yeah, there is a lively discussion. I mean, are these people real? Are they not real, right? And genuine in terms of their faith. And that's a question that we may never be able to answer for a lot of this, right? So with regard to Muhammad, misunderstanding Christian teaching, I'm referring to Orthodox general Christianity with regard to the Trinity, the deity of Christ, things like that. Does that help at all? Okay, all right. So good question. I'm glad somebody raised that, because I don't want to be misunderstood as though I'm giving a seal of approval to everything that goes by the name of Christian in church history. Far, far from it. But I also don't want to go to the extent, let me just say this before it's only 7:30, so we'll wrap here in a minute. I also don't want to adopt what I consider an extremist position and say that there was no genuine Christianity in medieval Europe. God always has his people. I don't think we need to ever say, well, there was no Christianity from the end of the church fathers to Martin Luther. I mean, God was saving people in the midst of that. Was the gospel eclipsed in medieval Europe? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. But I have no doubt that there were some priests, monks, individuals who at some point, they had an understanding of the gospel. And because again, God always has his remnant, and he's always building his church, even in periods like the Middle Ages, when so much of genuine biblical Christianity, what you and I count as the real deal, is eclipsed, it is hidden. So I don't want to go to the extent of saying, well, there just was no, all Christianity in the Middle Ages was cultural, historical, sociological. So anyway, good question. I do want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood on that point. Any other questions real quick before we depart? Yes, sir. Probably won't cover too much of that. So yeah, landmarkism, if you've ever heard of landmark Baptists. But I'm just curious, anybody in here who's heard of landmarkism? Really? Okay. So landmark Baptists would say that there have always been Baptist churches going all the way back to the beginning of Christian history. And they will try there's basically two schools of thought among landmarkers. You'll have some that will actually say we can identify them in history. And so if you've ever heard the Trail of Blood is what it's called, it's like a timeline of these various groups within Christian history that were real, genuine Baptist. And by Baptist, I mean they had church like we have church, okay? The problem is there are some real interesting groups that they would identify as Baptist, okay? Some of them were downright heretical. Some of them were just schismatic in the sense that, well, we want to go off and do our own thing. But other landmarkers would say, well, we don't have to identify them. We just know that they're there because Jesus said he would build his church. So even if we can't identify them historically, they had to be there because a true church is a Baptist church and so forth. So that's probably the extent to which we'll cover landmarkism. I'm not a landmarkist. Let me just say that. I do think that, I am a Baptist. We're not part of a Baptist denomination, but we're Baptistic, and I count myself a Baptist because I believe in regenerate church membership and believers' baptism by immersion, and also other Baptist distinctives like religious liberty and separation of church and state. But I just don't know that I have to be able to identify a Baptist church at every period of church history. That just doesn't seem like, because I believe, because landmarkers would also deny things like, well, that Presbyterian church down the road is a genuine church. Oh, no, they're not. They're not Baptist. Well, I'm not willing to go that far, right? So it's a good question. All right? Yes. Okay. Yeah. That's a Baptist church. That's a Baptist church. Yeah, falling asleep during the preaching? Yeah, that's definitely Baptist. That's a good point. You may have just turned me into a landmarkist. So, you may have just turned me into a landmarkers because you're right. You're right. That's funny. That's funny. All right. Well, listen, guys, it's 7:35. Y'all be safe out there. Please do remember, check your email if you don't check your email a lot, because we'll need to communicate with you what's going on Sunday. Even if for some reason we're having church, but those of you that live out, don't risk, okay? We understand. It's fine. Stay safe, okay? So look forward to seeing you all whenever we see one another by the providence of God. Father, go with us, we pray, and keep us safe. Thank you for this time where we can discuss these matters, these very important matters of how you have built your church over time, and help it to just be edifying to us, and not just a way that we can acquire some more facts, but that we might turn this into a worshipful experience. God, we do love you. We thank you that you have redeemed us. And we know, Lord, that we fall far short of the Christian ideal so many times ourselves, like our brothers and sisters in the past. And that's why, Father, we never cease to rely on your mercy and to plead